Through the Long Night. It was when we were recording our second album. We were in this remote residential studio in the West Country. It used to be a farm, but the owners weren't making much money, so they converted part of it into a studio in the late 60s. They didn't make much money from it afterwards either, mind you. But anyway, there were some bands we liked, some big albums that were recorded there in the 70s and 80s. So we requested it for that reason. It was great because you could make as much noise as you wanted and you wouldn't disturb anyone, except for a few cows and hens and things. And the owners were pretty old and deaf by then anyways, and they were used to it. They'd heard everything and seen everything, used to groups of hairy young men being hairy young men. Anyway, me and Smithy were in the barn, as they call it. It's the name for the main studio. Quite late one night, just doing some overdubs and stuff. Yeah, it was about 3 a.m, and we were knackered. But we decided to pull an all-nighter to get the work done. So we went into the kitchen and made coffee. We sat there in this dingy old room that looked like it hadn't been refitted since the dawn of time. Mousetraps in all the corners and salt all over the floor so the slugs wouldn't get in. And he announces he's off for one of his, he's off to use the little boy's room, shall we say, and he'll be back in a bit. As this was obviously pre-internet, I just sat there twiddling my thumbs on my own, drinking this terrible coffee, waiting for Smithy to come back, when there's this knock at the door. I jumped right out of my skin. It's a big old wooden door, you see, and it leads directly outside onto the courtyard. I go over and open it, and there's this little old man standing there shivering. Yes, this was the middle of February. And I said, "Can I help you?" He says, "Do you know the way to town?" And he's quite frail, very old-fashioned, pretty quiet. He's wearing this tatty old tweed jacket and hobnail boots, and he's got a walking stick. He must have been in his late 60s or so, at a guess. I say, "You go out of the yard and you turn right, and at the end of the farm track there's a path that goes down into town." And he says, "Much obliged. Is it far?" I said, "Well, it's about 2 miles," thinking, what's this old geezer doing walking out here in the middle of the night? So I invited him in and made him a cup of tea, and he sits down on Smithy's seat, which he always leaves about 4 foot from the table for everyone to trip over. So I ask him what he's doing out here at this time of night, and he says, "I'm trying to get back to my daughter's house. She lives in the town. I'm visiting her, you see." And I said, "What are you doing up here at this time?" And he says, "I went for a walk. I think I got a bit lost." So I go, "Well, we would give you a lift, but I've been drinking. Because, we might have been young and reckless, but we were responsible." And he says not to worry. He doesn't touch his tea. He goes, "You don't look like a farmhand." And I try and tell him I'm a musician in a rock band, and this is a recording studio. He doesn't seem to have a clue what I'm on about. And they ask him when he set off, for his walk he was on. And he said something like, "I left the house at about midday, because they left me on my own. And I was up on the hill watching the planes fly over." And I'm like, "Planes? What planes were they then?" And he says, "The Hurricanes. There's a base not far from here." Which was true. There was an RAF base nearby. So I said, "Are you sure there were Hurricanes?" And he goes, "Well, they may have been Spitfires, I suppose. But there was a hurricane crashed up there on the hill, So I think there must have been." And I'm thinking, benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were having some kind of commemorative flyby, if there was a plane crash there during the war kind of thing. But then he says, "And I couldn't find shelter. And I think there were some German planes around today. Oh, I'll be in trouble when I get home, I can tell you." "Your daughter's probably just worried where you are," I said. He looked a bit puzzled and then nodded. Obviously, this was before mobile phones, and there wasn't even a landline in the studio or anything. so he couldn't call anyone for him either. And he just keeps coming out with this stuff about the war and planes above the hills and stuff. And I'm convinced he thinks we're still in the 40s or something. I tried to think of a question I could ask him to ascertain this, without being rude. And the best I could come up with was something like, were you called up? Or something like that. And he chuckles a bit and goes, yeah, I was the wrong age. Otherwise I would have volunteered. Anyway, I must get home or I'll be in trouble. And he gets up and grabs his stick and makes to leave. I'm like, why don't you stay till the morning? And the farmer will run you into town. It was pretty bloody cold out there that night. You get really strong winds up there because there wasn't much shelter, and you were high up. But he just keeps going on about how he needs to get home. He really needs to get home. I was pretty young at the time, so I didn't really have the authority to make him stay till morning. So I just opened the door for him and reminded him which way it was. And I sit back down again, and I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have let him go. But then Smithy comes back in and asks who I'm talking to. And I tell him that there was this little old man who came in. He's like, what little old man? I didn't hear anyone. I tried to explain that he'd knocked on the door and asked which way it was to town, and that I'd invited him in for a cup of tea, and that he'd sat down in his chair and seemed to think it was still the war. Anyway, Smithy, on hearing all this, goes white as a sheet and is like, mate, you just saw a ghost. And I laughed and said, no, look, his tea's still there. And Smithy quite rightly points out that it hadn't been drunk, and that he'd left his chair out from the table and asked me if I'd actually seen him touch anything, which of course I hadn't. So I opened the door, just starting to feel a little bit freaked out, hoping to see the old man still in the courtyard, but he wasn't there. So we walked outside and shone our torches down the path where the man was heading, but there was no sign of him anywhere. So, obviously I started to doubt myself because, it was the middle of the night. And Smithy was absolutely convinced I'd seen a ghost. And I told him everything I've just told you. Well, he notices things I hadn't. He was the wrong age to fight in the war. I said, yeah, he would have been a kid back then. Smithy says, no, he was an old man back then. And I'm thinking, don't be ridiculous. But he's like, he couldn't find shelter from the planes. And that sends a bit of a chill through me when I realise what he means. And I'm like, oh my God, maybe he's right. Maybe this guy was strafed by a German fighter plane during the war or something. And he's still walking around on the hillside trying to find his way home. Now I really started to get freaked out. I'm like, well, what if we tell the farmers about it? And they're like, oh yes, lots of people have said they've seen him round here at night. Or something. The thing was, in the morning, the farmer's wife was there letting the hens out, and we asked her, do you know anything about an old man who died up here during the war? And she goes, no. Why, what do you mean? And later on, they found his body further down the footpath. He'd obviously tripped and fallen and couldn't get back up again. He'd grown up in the town and moved back in with his daughter later in life, and she was obviously distraught. She'd been at work and he'd managed to get out and had ended up on the hillside where he used to play as a boy. And people sometimes say when they're recording there, especially late at night, that they can see the figure of an old man walking down the farm track, trying to get to town, trying to get back to his daughter. But I say, if you see an old man walking helplessly alone at night, for the love of God, don't leave him alone. Help him out.